left with the grain, and down he goes. Josh Tupu, and
You're thinking about the back, the ankle, but he gets thrown to the ground.
Some type of an injury on this play. We have Teddy Bridgewater in the game right now. Tagovailoa, oh boy, getting up. Oh my goodness, that's an awful sight to see.
Hey, what's up everybody? It's Nick Davenport, aka Mr. Mental Muscle. Today we have another episode of the Mental Breakdown channel. And as you can see from those devastating clips, quarterback from the Miami Dolphins, Tua Tagovailoa, he's currently recovering after 2 back-to-back major hits that he's taken. And a lot of people are questioning on was he even supposed to be on the field after the first one, or the whole protocol of the NFL or just the Dolphins in general of what is the precautions to take place, or whether or not a player should be on the field. Now, today, I'm not here to talk about or judge the actions of the Miami Dolphins coaching staff or team or any other aspects of the politics involved with players going on the field after suffering a traumatic brain injury or concussion. I more so want to look at what exactly is a concussion and traumatic brain injury, or TBI, how our brain actually works and is affected by these things, how our brain even responds to high impact hits, and just go over overall understanding of all these thoughts. And it's also not meant to diagnose either. This is not a clinical aspect. My background is in applied psychology, so my perspective always will be from the psychological approach of performance or how it affects the performance. So that's what this will be more so of. So with that being said, let's break it down with science and psychology as we always do. Let's get into it. Now, what is a concussion? Now, the term TBI or traumatic brain injury and concussion are usually used synonymously. Now, when you look at the general sense of it, they kind of are the same thing, but from a medical standpoint, they're not. A TBI is a traumatic brain injury, meaning it's an injury sustained from a hit, usually trauma, blunt force trauma of some type, or some type of impact to the head or affecting the head, and by proxy affecting the brain. So that's what a TBI is. Now, a concussion kind of goes more into the symptoms and the long-term duration of what happens once you sustain that brain injury. So it's not necessarily they're different or synonymous. It's just a matter of what is the context and how we're using it, and what is the protocols taken when we're dealing with the patient or the client at hand. Now, when you're dealing with concussion symptoms, you can see things such as changes in mood, disposition, behavior, depression. So that's an emotional side of how you're affected by concussions. And a lot of times people don't even talk about that. They usually talk about like loss of consciousness, sensitivity to light. These things do happen. Also nausea, the cognitive decline, so you're not able to process as efficiently. And if you know my line of work, that's something we do promote with our training protocols and programs. But overall, a concussion is something that is not necessarily an end-all be-all. You can't just look at someone and know. Because when you think about how complex the brain truly is, it's not that simple to put it into those terms. So let's talk about that. Now, obviously, we all know we have a brain. The brain is how we process information, take in the environment, make decisions, move our body, everything that we literally do. But do you know how it even takes place? So let's actually take a look on how the brain even works. Now, we won't get too deep into the brain anatomy, but let's understand how at least neurons work. So neurons are tiny messengers. These are brain cells that send and receive signals. There's billions of them, and their main job is to transmit signals through electric impulses. There's actual electric activity going on within your brain, and obviously you don't feel it, but this is how it transmits these signals. Now, there's synapses. These are the endpoints of each neuron. So there's an axon and a dendrite. The axon is what extends out to release the signal, and the dendrite receives the signal. Now, they don't actually touch. What happens is they release neurochemicals. You ever heard a term like dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine? These are actually the chemicals that's communicating, that excites the neuron, that gets it to do what it needs to do given the situation. Now, every time we do something, let's say you want to pick up an object, the signal from the brain creates this electric impulse that sends it to the working muscle, which is a motor neuron, which makes it contract and does what it needs to do to pick up that said item. But you also have different processes to factor in your thoughts, emotions. So all of this goes on. So when you think about how the brain functions, it's a collective of chemical properties as well as physical properties in the brain that make the things you do happen. So when we talk about a concussion or any type of brain injury, you're damaging this system. Now, this kind of segues into my next point. Our heads were not designed for impact. Some animals are. If you look through the animal kingdoms, there are different types of animals that headbutt each other, such as moose, such as deer, rams, and this one might be shocking, but the woodpecker. Yes, let's go into that one. Now, the woodpecker it may not be a head-to-head contact animal against its other rivals, but it has to hit the tree with its beak at a lot of force. Now, how their brain is designed, their tongue actually wraps around the brain, forming a layer, a cushion, if you will, to help the brain sustain the impact. Now, if you look at our brain, it's not the same. Our brain sits inside our skull, and there's cerebral fluid that it sits in. So it's not attached to the actual skull. So that means when it's shaken up, it can actually hit the sides of the walls. Now, these impacts can cause minor to severe damage because when it hits the side of those walls, it releases different neurochemicals that can be seen as a protectant, an inflammatory or immune response, but they actually do more harm than good because now it's invoking this response when it doesn't need it, and it breaks down the neurons. And when neurons get broken down or die, that means they can't fire as efficiently. And if this happens, our brain cannot function. So this can mean loss of movement capacity, speech patterns. It can get very severe. If you've seen the movie Concussion, there's a scene in Concussion where Will Smith's character, he plays Dr. Bennett Amalu, who is the real neuropathologist that found that Mike Webster, Steelers Hall of Famer, was suffering from what he would later call CTE. And this is when the actual brain suffers from these things called plaques and tangles. These plaques and tangles are typically seen in people with dementia and Alzheimer's. But if you see these football players who suffer from it, they're much younger. They show these signs much earlier, and you can't diagnose it until you're dead because you have to take apart the brain and see what's happening. So I'm gonna demonstrate a part of that scene. So in this cup, there's a tennis ball, right? So your brain, when it hits the side of the wall, it's just like this tennis ball floating in fluid. And when you shake it up, it's hitting that impact and it's causing that damage because it's not settled in. And every time we get hit, even at a minor level, this impact happens. Now, the more force, the worse it can be. So to give you some perspective, an average NFL hit can be between 5 to 8 Gs. Gs is how we measure force. When you think about Gs, you usually think about missiles, rockets, planes, or even race cars. So to give you perspective, 5 Gs is about as much force as being in an F1 Formula 1 car. Now think about that kind of force hitting you. And people get caught up in the actual head-to-head contact. And honestly, if you see from Tua's clips, that's not always the case. It's actually from the force whipping you back. That's bad enough because your brain's getting rattled. And then when you hit the ground, your head immediately falls back. And then it not only has the force of shaking your head up, then it hits the ground, concrete, whatever it is, and that adds more impact. So there's no really safe way to do this. And that's one of the biggest arguments in today's times is, should kids play football or should anyone play football? And I work with a lot of pro athletes in football, and most will argue don't stop the sport. But there's things we can try to take into account for it. But at the end of the day, there's no safe way to approach this completely. There'll always be a risk factor. And sadly, as we saw with Tua, this can go very badly. Now, like I said, I'm not going to get into the fact of should he went back to the game because I have my opinions about that. But I want to go more so on what it takes to be clear from a concussion. And there's really no true answer with that, because when we talk about concussion recovery, it's not as noticeable, especially from a medical sense. People can say, what about a CAT scan or MRI? Now, those things can show actual damaged skull fractures or the blood leaking through the brain. Things of that nature can show up in those scans. But the actual neurochemical activity, like I mentioned, the neurons fire, that's something you can't see. And once that neurochemistry has been altered, it may be irreversible or hard to reverse, and that recovery may be a long, long road. So the answer is, I can't give you an answer. Like I said, I'm not here to diagnose. There's professionals who have more detailed ways of that, but it's still a burgeoning field to get it right because there's so much we don't know about the brain. So when you think about it, just to recap, when you have those impacts, it's just not the matter at the force your head got hit. It's the fact that there's a chemical response and an inflammatory response. Just like when you get sick, your body responds. It's the same thing when the brain gets injured or hurt, and it has to amend it. But these things can cause more harm than good because the amount of stress that's being put on the actual brain is doing more than it can take. And if this is repetitious over time, especially if you're a football player, you've done this for 15, 20 years, pretty much your whole life, that's a lot of impact, and this all adds up. And now if you chemically change the altering of your brain to the point where it's firing in a way that's inefficient, when you can't move as efficiently as you used to, or you're forgetting things, can't remember where you place certain objects, or just having brain fog, these are symptoms that come along with concussion. We talk about the balance, and like I said, the emotional and mood changes is one of the biggest. When we talk about that side, you usually thought of is what's wrong with this guy? Why did he get more aggressive? It's kind of like the case of Phineas Gage. This is a more extreme example of head trauma, but in Phineas Gage's case, back in the 1800s, he was a foreman at a construction site building a railroad. He was packing in gunpowder with a long metal rod, and it sparked and exploded, and the rod went through the bottom of his chin, through the top of his head. Now, he amazingly recovered. People were surprised, and at first they didn't even believe it because he was able to talk. He was coherent after he got up and, dusted himself off. Even the doctor didn't believe him until he pulled a piece of his brain and said, hey, look. So what they did notice, though, his behavior changed, because regions of the brain that control behavior is usually in the frontal lobe. And that's part of the region that Phineas Gage got affected. Now, bring this back to concussions in football. It's not that extreme as actual blunt force putting a hole through the top of your head. But the fact is, you get affected by this on a deeper level. Once it happens so much, your brain isn't the same brain it once was, and this could be a problem. So from the physical standpoint, you want them to be okay, but thinking that if his brain can't function, like you saw his hands froze up like that, that's pretty much meaning his neurons are trying to all fire at once. It's like an overload, because you think about it, remember, it's an electric impulse from the brain. The neurons are firing. So if all neurons are trying to fire erratically and not in a systematic way as it typically does, that means everything's going off at once. It's kind of like when they talk about how someone gets electrocuted and you see them fly back 20 feet. That's not because necessarily just electricity. It's the fact that it made all their muscles contract so forcefully that it blew them back as well. And that's kind of an example, because when his hands were like that in that position, it means that his brain was firing in a way that's not regular. It's an irregular firing pattern, and this is not good. So to wrap this up, the best recovery, hopefully Tua can recover, not even just for his football career, but just his life. I talk about athletic identity all the time. That's more in my niche of how you perform, but this is part of it. He has a life outside of sport, and hopefully the fans and other teams can understand this, and this is bigger than football. So thanks for tuning in, guys. I appreciate you as always. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, share the video, and as always, get your mind right.